Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim, daf mem aleph. This is the daf for Shabbat. Today's daf is sponsored by Donna Hochhauser in loving memory of Rachel Bat Nisan. We're going to get started today with a review of yesterday's daf, and I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to be able to see chart it out what we need to know here. So we start from this pasuk asal lapar kasher asal lapar chatat, and we basically are trying to figure out why is this extra word lipar there, because we already know we're talking about the bull. Why are we adding this extra word? Due to the bull. We already know it's the bull. We're in the context of the par, helen dever shel tzibor, the people follow a mistaken, erroneous ruling of the court. We do to that bull the way we do to the bull that was mentioned previously, which is the par of the kohen and Mashiach, which is when the kohen makes an erroneous ruling and then follow the kohen gadol and then follows his own ruling. So now we're trying to figure out why that extra word lipar is there. And we, in fact, say, we saw this drasha, lipar is the par of Yom Kippurim. Okay, there's a bright I brought in the beginning. We're going to come back to this later. Okay, but right now we're going to say the par is talking about the par of Yom Kippurim. So now we have a question. For what purpose? In other words, it's bringing it out of the blue. It's just that word is really unnecessary. So we're going to say, that's the par of Yom Kippurim. And what we want to do is we want to compare the par of Yom Kippurim to the par of the kohen and Mashiach. Right, the par of the one is brought by the kohen gadol in Yom Kippur to atone for his sins, and the other one is brought by a kohen gadol who makes an erroneous ruling. So what's the halacha? In what way is it the same? Rabbi Yehuda said it's to teach you that the sprinklings are necessary, are critical. Can't do it without it. Just like in the kohen and Mashiach, also in Yom Kippur. Rav Pappa says you don't need to learn it from there. That's obvious from other places. He says it's teaching you this three-part law of et dam ubitfilah. Okay, it says the taval kohen et etzba'o badam. We're going to darshan taval, et, and badam. I'm not going to go through the three things we learned there, but those three halachot are needed. We want to learn from the par kohen and Mashiach to also the par of Yom Kippur. Okay, and that's how he gets it. Now, to here, the Gemara brings a braita to say, Rebbi, Rav Pappa matches Rebbi. Here's a strength and chizuk proof for Rav Pappa. Because Rebbi also does that. And we saw the braita, where Rebbi basically holds, okay, it says, Asa kasher asa, mata lomar lapal. Why does it say to the par? L'rabot par Yom Kippurim l'chomash amor b'inyan. Okay, it's to include the par Yom Kippurim is everything it says by the par kohen and Mashiach is relevant for the par Yom Kippurim. We're going to come back to that line soon. But that includes, okay, the et b'dam v'taval, and that's what it's coming for. But that braita also brought Rabbi Yishmael, who totally disagreed and said, no. Lipar is actually talking about in the context. Don't take it to something completely different. The bull offering on Yom Kippur, that wasn't what the parak was talking about. It's for the parlim dever shel tzibor, which we're going to have to ask later, well, why say the bull then? Just say it. We know we're talking about the bull. That's the context. But anyway, we'll get to that later. But now Rabbi Yishmael said, you want to learn that et b'dam par is true also for, okay, by the way, this chart I did here on the sheet is the one where it says taval etzba'o b'dam. This is to show where in the Torah these things appear. So taval etzba'o b'dam appears by the par kohen and Mashiach and the parlim dever shel tzibor. It does not appear by the bull and the goat offering on Yom Kippur, and it doesn't appear either, by the way, by the seir of Avodah Zarah. Now we're going to talk about all this and why this is important. And then we're going to see other things, which we'll get back to later, that appear in the Torah in some of these places, but doesn't appear in the Torah in all the places. Okay, so that we're going to get back to. So now, Rabbi Yishmael says, and maybe one of them we'll look at, which is the sprinkling 7 times appears in the Torah by the par kohen and Mashiach. Again, that's the sin offering of the kohen gadol for erroneous rulings and mistakes made. Parlim dever shel tzibor, also erroneous rulings. The sin offering also needs to be sprinkled 7 times, and both the bull and the goat offering on Yom Kippur, it says that has to be sprinkled 7 times. That's when we say in our davening, achad echad ve'achad, echad v'shtayim, echad v'shalosh, etc. We count 7 sprinklings. So now, comes Rabbi Yishmael and says, you don't need to learn that from a drasha in the pasuk from, this bull of Yom Kippur is like that bull, and that's why he doesn't take it to Yom Kippur, because it's a kal v'chomer. And the kal v'chomer works like this. Ma b'mkom shelo hu shveh korban lekorban, in a place where the 2 korbanot are very different, because one's a bull and one's a goat, for example, we're going to get to right now, and yet hishveh ma'asim l'ma'asim, which we saw is, what is that case? Okay, if you start 3 lines from the bottom of Mem Amud Bet, to hai par v'hasi'ir, Hushvu masim lemasim lamai dekatuv behu. They don't tell you too much, but what they seem to be talking about is the parhel and davar shel tzibor and the seir of Yom Kippurim are similar, and yet they're different, right? They're two totally different animals, and yet they're similar because the Torah says by both of them you have to sprinkle the blood 7 times. So makom shehu shva korban lekorban, in a place where it is compared, meaning, for example, the par Yom Kippur and the par kohen Mashiach, where it's the high par of a high par, that's a bull and that's a bull. Ein odin shehu shvu masim lemasim. Wouldn't it be obvious then that their actions are compared to each other? Meaning, et bedam taval, which applies by the par kohen Mashiach, will apply to the par Yom Kippurim as well. Because if in a case where they're two totally different animals and yet have similar halachot, obviously when they're the same animal, they're going to have the same halachot. If you notice here, there's 2 lines, because it's not just that we're going to learn. Atele par Yom Kippurim le et bedam utfilah mi par kohen Mashiach. Sorry, that's what we just did, right? So you get the par Yom Kippurim gets the et, dam, and tefillah from the par kohen Mashiach. And number 2, va'atele se'ir Yom Kippurim mi se'ir avodah zarah mikal v'chomer. And you can get the se'ir on Yom Kippur from the se'ir, the se'ir on Yom Kippur and the se'ir avodah zarah. You're going to learn one from the other from a kal v'chomer. So now which are you going to learn? The se'ir avodah zarah also has this epidam taval. Now this is a little tricky. Go up to your chart and look what it says. Taval tzbobadam, does it appear in Bamidbar Tevav by the seir that people, if they did an erroneous ruling of the court based on avodah zarah, they have to bring a sin offering? It does not say taval tzbobadam, so that's a little tricky. But they're assuming it applies there. We'll get back to there in a minute. And therefore, we're going to learn that the seir on Yom Kippur also, the laws of epidam taval apply there. Okay, remember that was with if there's no chatzitz, if you have a wart, and how much blood has to be in there, and how much you have to take out. Okay, those 3 laws. So now the Gemara is going to say, wait a minute, how do we learn? Okay, now we're just struggling with the second one. The seir of Yom Kippurim, we're going to learn for the seir of avodah zarah, but how can we do that? V'chi davar lamei behekesh, chozerim lamei b'kav chomer. The seir of avodah zarah was learned by a hekesh. What hekesh? Well, if you go back to this bright I brought in the beginning of the page, the study guide, one of the things we learned in that pasuk, asalapar kasher asalapar ha-chatat. Why did it say chatat? Chatat comes to teach you that's the seir of avodah zarah. And from there, we learn that the seir of avodah zarah has similar laws to the par kohen Mashiach and the par helen davar shel tzibor even maybe, but really the par kohen Mashiach, which is the epidam taval. Taval kohen, that's ba'obadam, which appears by the kohen Mashiach. And therefore, we're going to learn from there also to the Yom Kippur, to the seir of avodah zarah. Now, here's the problem. If we learn it from a hekesh, because those 2 things are juxtaposed in the pasuk, and that's where we get the seir needs the law, has the laws of epidam taval. Right? In general, we learn in kodshim that if you have a juxtaposition, you can't learn a juxtaposition from a juxtaposition. And therefore, they assume you also can't learn a kal v'chomer from a juxtaposition. So how can we make a kal v'chomer and learn from the seir avodah zarah to the seir Yom Kippurim when the seir avodah zarah was learned out in general from just a juxtaposition? To which Rav Pappa, he answers, Kasavar Tana de Rabbi Yishmael, the Breita, right, the author from the house of Rabbi Yishmael who says this, must hold the Tabar Lamei Behakesh Chozer Lamei Bekav Chomer. He doesn't have a problem with learning something derived from a juxtaposition, could then teach a kav chomer. Okay, now we're going to go on to the next line of the Breita. This is all dealing with the Breita that had Rebbi and Rabbi Yishmael. And we dealt with the first part of Rabbi Yishmael, who basically said we don't need the par to be teaching about the par Yom Kippurim, because the halacha of Yom Kippur we could learn from a kav chomer. Done. Now we go to the words lipal, ze par halim davar shel tzibor. So now the Gemara is going to ask, wait a minute, why do we need the word lipar then? Habit tzibor gufei ktiv. That's the context of it. We don't need you to tell us the par. We know it's the bull. That's what we're talking about. So why did it add that word? So Amar Rav Pappa, mishum debai li'igmurei par halim davar shel tzibor beyoteret ukshte klayot l'sirei avodah zarah. Okay, that's a big mouthful. What does this mean? Well, what we're really going to say, and I'll tell you kind of the end, okay, that we really want to learn something from the par halim davar shel tzibor to the seir of avodah zarah. But the problem is that without the word lepar, we really only learn it from a juxtaposition. And if it's, now, okay, you have to understand like this. Let's start from the end. How are we going to learn from the par halim davar shel tzibor to the seir of avodah zarah? By a juxtaposition. And then we want to derive a halacha that the Paralim Davar Shel Tzibur only was learned out by a juxtaposition. You can't have a juxtaposition on a juxtaposition. That nobody thinks you could have. So now let's go and fill in the details. What are we trying to figure out? And for this, I'm going to go back to that chart that I said, that charts out where it says in the Torah the different topics. So it talks about, let's start with the Par Kohen HaMashiach, because everything appears there. The Kohen dips his finger in the blood. I just want to remind you, it was the first place this sin offering was mentioned, so it also makes sense that everything is there. He sprinkles 7 times, burns the fats, and also burns, among other things, the shtei klayot, the 2 kidneys, and the yoteret hakaved, and the lobe of the liver. Those in general are called the imurim, and those are the parts that get burned of every sacrifice. And again, in this case, the bulls are going to be burnt completely, but outside the temple, not on the altar. On the altar, you have to bring these parts. But it only says the shtei klayot and the yoteret hakaved in the Par Kohen HaMashiach. Doesn't say it by Paralim Davar Shel Tzibur, doesn't say it by the Par and Seir of Yom Kippur, and doesn't say it by the Seir of Avodah Zarah. So now I want you to notice, by the way, the Seir of Avodah Zarah says none of these things, because the Torah there doesn't really get into detail. If you want to look in Bamidbar chapter 15, you can see it gives very few details of the actual sacrificing of the korban. Okay, so now we want to, though, learn all the halachot from the other places. So Rav Pappa comes and says, why does it say lepar, teaching you Paralim Davar Shel Tzibur? Well, because they want to teach you, I'll go back to the words. By Agmurei Paralim Davar Shel Tzibur b'yoteret v'shtei klayot. It wants to teach you the laws that the yoteret hakaved and shtei klayot get burned in the Paralim Davar Shel Tzibur, and from there we're going to learn that also in the Seir of Avodah Zarah. Now, we have to build a few things how we do this. So Paralim Davar Shel Tzibur b'gufei lo k'tiv, it doesn't say it in that section. Behekesh ate, it's only learned from a hekesh to the Par Kohen HaMashiach. Therefore, it's tzrich lepal. If it had just said, do it like you did to the par of the Kohen HaMashiach, then that would be a classic juxtaposition. But because it adds the word to the bull, talking about the Paralim Davar Shel Tzibur, from there, the communal sin offering, from there we learn, it turns it into a case where it's as if it was actually said explicitly. And then that allows us, from a hekesh, which we haven't seen yet, to get from the Paralim Davar Shel Tzibur to the Seir of Avodah Zarah, because it's as if it's written explicitly, because it added the word lepar. Okay, that's why we have the word lepar. Okay, now we're going to bring a braita that supports this. Tanya Kavatei to Rav Pappa, and in bringing this braita, we're going to see what the hekesh is, because it's going to be a little more elaborate. Asa ka'asher asa, matamud lomar lapal. So do to it like you did, right? Why does it say lapal? Asa lapal kasher asa. Could have just said asa kasher asa lepar, right? Why does it need the first part? Lefi shene'emal. Now we're quoting now a pasuk in Bamidbar Tefav, which is in the section about the community that erroneously worships idols. Again, the majority of the community does it because the court taught them that it was okay. Now, I know, what do you mean it's okay to worship idols? If you remember, if you learned Torah, they taught that something, that you thought maybe was Avodah Zarah isn't really Avodah Zarah, and it turns out it really was Avodah Zarah. Okay. Now, why does it say Lepal? Lefi shene'emal, v'hem hiviu et korbanam yishel Hashem, okay, and then they bring their korban as an ishet to God. V'chatat lefnei Hashem al shigigat, v'chatatam, sorry, this is a mistake, it should be chatatam lefnei Hashem al shigigatam. So now we're going to darshan this. Chatatam elu seirei avodah zarah. Shigigatam ze paralim davar shel tzibur. Now they're going to say the following, right? They bring their sin offering, right? Their korban, their chatatam, their sin before God on account of their mistake. Now, the simple reading is, this is the sin that they did by mistake. But they say chatatam must be one thing, shigigatam is something else. So now they say, chatatam is seirei avodah zarah. Shigigatam is paralim davar shel tzibur, because that's a shgaga, right? The chatat is the one mentioned in the pasuk. That's what we're talking about. That's why it's the seir of avodah zarah. But the shigigatam is the offering we bring for when it's not avodah zarah. And now, here we're going to have the comparison, the juxtaposition. Chatatam al shigigatam, right? That's what it says in the pasuk. Their chatat before God on their sin. Amra Torah chatatam harehi lacha kishigigatam. Your sirezim, fill in the blank, right? Chatatam, we said, is the goat offerings for avodah zarah, are like the bull offering offered by the community. Shigigatam mehechalamadita. Now, what's the problem? Shigatam, where do you learn it? Lobe hekesh. V'chi davar lamei behekesh. Chozero lamei behekesh. Here we go back to exactly what we said before. But that's going to put you in a problem, though. If you want to learn that, okay, going back, what are we trying to learn here? That the yoteret and the shtei klayot get burned also in the seer lavodah zara, but it was only learned to the parlim davar shel tzibur by hekesh. And if you learn it by juxtaposition, you can't do a juxtaposition on a juxtaposition. So Talmud Lomar, that's why it says lepal ze parlim davar shel tzibur, and the second lepal ze par kohen Mashiach. And then it's as if we learned it explicitly by the parlim davar shel tzibur, even though it really is learned by juxtaposition, but that extra word is giving it more strength. And then we can go learn from there to something else. Okay. So that kind of closes that section, which is we now finished understand the bright of Rabbi Yishmael. We had the Kavach Homer, which we explained and filled in the blank. What is the Kavach Homer talking about? And that was all to say, we don't need a drasha of lepar to be the par Yom Kippurim, because we can learn that from a Kavach Homer. And then, so what's lepar? Parlim davar shel tzibur. Why do you need it? Exactly for this reason. And we bring this brighta to support. In order to say, it's as if we learn directly for the yoteret and the shtei klayot, and therefore we can learn from there to sirei avodah zara. Okay, now, we have a difficulty with this brighta. Amar chatatam elu sirezim. Now, why do you have to say that? Typically, mikra kama. Da amar chatatam. So now they're going to say, why do we need a chatatam to be sirei avodah zara? Typically, mikra kama da amar ha-chatat. Sorry, this is also a mistake. This should be ha-chatat. L'rabot sirei avodah zara. Okay, what's that? Go back to the earlier braita. What did it say in that braita? It said, ha-chatat elu sirei avodah kochavim. We already have a juxtaposition. It's already juxtaposed in the pasuk in Vayikra chapter 4. Asa lapar kasher asa lapar chatat. There we already have this juxtaposition. So why are you using the other juxtaposition? Okay, so now we're going to explain. I'll fix these mistakes in the study guide right after class. So if you get it online, it'll be more corrected. Right? This again should say hachatat, which is l'rabot sirei avodah zara. So Rav Pappa itzrich. Why do you need two drashot to have this? Right? Why do we need two drashot? Okay, so here, and again, I did it wrong in this chart. It should be hachatat. Now, let's see if I can add it in here. Hachatat. Okay, I don't know how to do that. Hachatat. No. Okay, hachatat, basically, not chatatam. Hachatat l'rabot sirei avodah zara. So now, what do we do with both of them? Well, sakadat achamina hanimile hazaot tichtivam bigufei. I would have thought this means hazaot, sprinklings. In other words, if you just had chatatam elu sirezim, I would have said that's the sprinklings. Or the truth is, it probably if you just had hachatat, dichtive begufei. In other words, if you're going to learn something by a juxtaposition, one thing, then I would assume that's going to be the sprinklings. Because, okay, let's go back. Remember what I said. In the Sir Avodah Zarah, it says nothing here. Not dipping the finger, not the 7 times, not the chelev, and not the shtei klayot. So if you're going to have one, which is this, the first one, ha-chatat, I would have thought that was just to teach you the 7 sprinklings, that the Sir Avodah Zarah also have to sprinkle 7 times. But there, the yoteret and shtei klayot wasn't written in the parlim davar shel tzibur. So maybe if we're making a comparison to the parlim davar shel tzibur to the Sir Avodah Zarah, maybe it would just be what was written explicitly. Kamash v'lan, that's why we need 2 different drashot. We need again both hachatat that we had in the previous braita on the earlier daf, elu sirei avodah kochavim, and the one we have by us, which is chatatam al shigigatam, which is comparing, right, the chatatam is elu sirei avodah zara, and that's compared to shigatam. We make a juxtaposition from one to the other. And that's how we can learn both about hazaot, the sprinklings, and also about the yoteret and the shtei klayot. Okay, good. Now that finished, right, that totally completed our braita of Rabbi Yishmael, and it also went back and dealt with this, through that we got to this other braita, and then we went a little bit in depth into that. Now we're going to go back to this original braita that was on that I put earlier on the page. Amalei Rav Huna Bereid Rav Natan Rav Pappa. V'hatana par Yom Kippurim L'chol, oh, sorry. No, we're not going back to this yet. 1 second. Right. Oh, yeah, we are. Okay, so let's just go back for a minute. This is why I brought it on the sheet. To the brighter we saw before. It said, Asa lepar kasher asa. Why does it say lepal? To teach you, we're back to Rebbi. L'rabot par Yom Kippurim l'chol ma she'amor be'inyan divrei Rebbi. Okay, we're actually going back, sorry, not to the bright I put at the beginning of this stuff, but the bright of Rebbi and Rabbi Yishmael. So until now we dealt with Rebbi a little, and we used Rebbi to prove Rav Pappa that lepar is actually par Yom Kippurim. Rabbi Yishmael said, no, you can learn that from a Kal V'chomer. But now we're back to that bright to what Rebbi said. Now we brought it to support Rav Pappa. What did Rav Pappa say? Rav Pappa said, what's the lepar coming to teach you? Et, Bidam, and Taval, those 3 halachot are learned out from par Kohen HaMashiach to par Yom Kippurim. And the same 3 halachot apply, even though it didn't say so in the Psukim. But Rebbi doesn't really say exactly the same thing. Rebbi says, it's l'rabot par Yom Kippurim l'chol ma she'amor binyan. Everything about the par Yom Kippur is like the par Kohen HaMashiach. So now they ask a question, Rav Pappa, from this Braita. And they say, Amalei Rav Huna Bered Rav Natan Rav Pappa. V'hatana par Yom Kippurim l'chol ma she'amar binyan kamar. And not just, right, the 3 things that you said. To which they answer, Tanai. It's a machloket Tanaim. Tana debei Rebbi merabe hachi. Sorry, Tana debei Rav. The Tana of Rav really learns everything. And that we take seriously from what Rebbi said. Everything. And the Tana debei Rabbi Yishmael lo merabe hachi. And there's another Braita that doesn't teach everything. Okay, just some things. And that, on that one, that's what Rav Pappa was relying on. Okay, so we have, right, and that's where it says, 1 second, Merabe Hachi, Lo Merabe Hachi, right. 1 second, Mr. Druvatani Rabbe. Right, I'm just looking at Rashi for a minute. Right, right. They actually say it differently than I do. Tana debei Rav merabe hachi. The Tana, actually, this Braita that was said in Divrei l'rabot par l'chol ma she'amor binyan is actually, they say, that was the school of Rabbi Yishmael that included everything here. And the earlier one, where we just said some things, which Rav Pappa wanted to rely on, which is the one where, at the beginning of our page, which is the Tanu Rabbanan, that's Divrei Rav, which is lepar ze par Yom Kippurim, and it's only coming to teach certain things and not everything. Okay, and with that, we explain the difference. Okay, and that's how Rav Pappa seems to be different than Rebbi, and that's okay. They're both coming from the same school of thought, that it's the par Yom Kippurim, but they're learning different things. One says for everything, which includes more things, and one says it's only for specific things. Okay, now we're going to bring 2 Braitot. Tana debei Rabbi Yishmael, also from the house of Rabbi Yishmael. By the way, all the Braitot in the house of Rabbi Yishmael don't have to all say the exact same thing. I just want to point that out, right? Because this seems to be a little different thing saying in the name of Rabbi Yishmael. That's fine, because they're different students from that school. Mipnei man emru yoteret u'shtei klayot b'par Kohen HaMashiach v'lo ne'emru b'par l'davar shel tzibor. Right, now why is the Yoteret and Shtei Klayot only written, that's what we saw in the chart before, it's only mentioned in one place. Why wasn't it written in the Parlim Davar Shel Tzibor, and specifically only in the Par Kohen HaMashiach? Mashal HaMelech Basar V'Dam, Sheza'am Al Ohavo, Umi'et B'Sirchono Mipnei Chibato. So they say this is a mashal for God, who got angry at his beloved one, and basically made it worse for him because he loved him. Now, what does it mean worse for him? So some people say, who are we talking about? The simple reading seems to be we're talking about, or I don't know, simple reading. But Rashi says, I think it's Rashi, right? Ohavo is the tzibur. God got angry when the tzibur, right? God's favorite is the community, everybody. So God got more angry at the tzibur, and therefore it didn't give them the opportunity to do more atonement. Okay? And kind of didn't mention that you're supposed to do these things. But a different explanation is given by the Maharsha, who says, no, it's Dafka the Kohen HaMashiach, and he's given more things to do because God loves him more, so he gives him more things to do. Okay, so however you understand it, but that's a mashal. And Tana Debei Rabbi Yishmael, another Braita, Mipnei man emra parochet hakodesh bepar Kohen HaMashiach, v'lo ne'emar bepar lim davar shel tzibor. Okay, when it says you're supposed to sprinkle it, okay, I told you. Sprinkling, it says both by the Par Kohen HaMashiach and also in the the parling davar shel tzibur, again, the kohen gadol one, and for the community. But it calls it, do the sprinklings on the parochet hakodesh, okay? And by the parling davar shel tzibur, it just says parochet. Why is that? Why did it get rid of the word kodesh? So they say, when the whole community rebelled against the king, if only some of them went against him, so he still has his people. But im ruba sarcha, now what's his people? The kodesh. When the kohen makes a mistake, it's still the majority of the community hasn't made a mistake, hasn't gone against God, so he still has the kodesh. But im ruba sarcha, if the majority of the community goes against God, then ein pamalia shalom et kayemet. Then he doesn't have anymore his pamalia, his chevra, which is the kodesh. And therefore the parochet loses its term HaKodesh. Okay. Now we're going to move on to the next section. Back to the original Mishnah. This is the first Mishnah on our chapter, okay, which was on Daf Lamed Vav Amud Bet at the bottom. And it said the following. It differentiated, if you remember, between the matanot, the placements of the blood that you do on the inner altar and the outer altar. In the outer altar, if you remember, it was all one, you do one and that's fine, except maybe the chatat where there was a machloka bet Shammai bet Hillel. And therefore, if the first one was pigul, it's pigul. If the second one was pigul, but the first one wasn't, it's not pigul, because the first one, basically, you fulfill your requirement. However, on the Mizbeach HaPnimi, which are all these korbanot that we've been discussing, when you have to bring it on the inner altar, you have to do it according to the exact amount that each one has, right, for each korban. And then, lefichach natan kulan ketiknan ve'echad shelo ketikna psula. The way we understood that is, if you put one the way it was supposed to, and all the rest, you put all of them, let's say 3, let's say you have to put 4 of the blood around the 4 corners, so you did 3 not correctly, but you did 1 correctly, then, I didn't say that right, natan kulan ketiknan, 3 were correct, and 1 was pigul, psula. It's disqualified and ein bo karet. Why is that? We explained because ein mefaglim b'chatzi matir. You don't have pigul if it was only part of what permitted. Now here you need all 4 to permit. So if it was only on part of it, it's not going to work. Right? Meaning it's not going to be pigul. Not that it's not going to work, it's just not going to be pigul. Okay, so what does the Gemara say now? Well, the Gemara first starts off quoting a Mishnah Menachot with a machloket Rabbi Meir and Chachamim, and it's charted out here on your daf. Pigel b'kometz v'lo b'levona, b'levona v'lo b'kometz. Okay. If you have a mincha, this is a Mishnah Menachot. You have a mincha offering, and the mincha has 2 things you're supposed to do, which are the matir. You take a kometz, you take a handful of the dough, and you take a handful of the frankincense, and then you put it on the altar. Now, what if when you were taking the handful of the kometz or the handful of the levona, you had a pigel machshava, so pigel b'kometz v'lo b'levona, b'levona v'lo b'kometz. Now, you did it on only one or not the other. So Rabbi Meir says, pigul, v'chayavim alav karet. Okay? He says that's pigul, and you get karet for it. We're going to explain him in a minute. We don't know yet why he says this. V'chachamim omrim, ein bo karet, ad she'ipagel b'chol hamatir. The rabbis say, right, and this is what we said, ein mefaglim b'chatzi matir. You only did part of the action, was pigul, but the whole thing is to do the kometz and the levona, right? Take from the dough and take from the frankincense. So you only did pigul and part of it, it's not going to be karet. So we're going to start with Rish Lakish. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Lo tema, don't say, now this is what you might have thought, don't say the Tama de Rabbi Meir de Kasavar Mefaglim B'chatzi Matir. Maybe he thinks there's pigul even on half a matir. So who cares that it was only half? That's pigul. You had a pigul machshav, it ruins it. Don't say that, he said. Ella, hacha b'mayaskina. What's the case on the Mishnah they're discussing? Kigon shenatan et hakometz b'machshava v'halavona b'shtika. The first action you did was to take the kometz from the dough. That you did with a machshava psula, with a pigul thought, intent. V'halavona b'shtika. And then you just continue going, and you took your lavona without any thought. So you thought when you were taking the kometz, I'm going to burn this tomorrow. And then you just go ahead and take the lavona without saying what your intent is. So that's the machloket. Rabbi Meir says, Kasaval, kol ha'oseh, al da rishona ha'oseh. Since you started off with the wrong thought, we assume you were silent the next thought. It must be you just continued your thought. And therefore the whole thing was done incorrectly. And the rabbis obviously say, no, we don't follow your first thought. One thought was pigul, one was nothing. Okay, your nothing thought is nothing. It's not ruined. So, and then it's mefaglim b'chatzi matir, right? And mefaglim b'chatzi matir. You only have pigul in half of the matir, it doesn't work. So Rabbi Meir, according to the way Rish Lakish understands it, he agrees with the rabbis that ein mefaglim b'chatzi matir. He just thinks that this is the whole matir because if you start off one way and then you're silent, we assume you just continued with the same thought. Now, where does he get this from? Mimai. Midekatane, he's going to learn it from our Mishnah. Okay, now it's going to be an inference from our Mishnah, so be careful. This is not what way we understood our Mishnah when we started. Midekatane lefichachim natan kulan ketiknan ve'echad shelo ketikna pasul ve'im bo karet. If you did one the way it's supposed to, and then all of them the way they're supposed to, and then one incorrectly, that's going to be, it's going to disqualify it because of the pigul thought, but it's not karet because one of them is pigul, but the rest are not. Now, here comes the big inference. Why did it specifically give it in that order? Okay, you noticed when I said it, I got confused which one was which and what was what because they're going to start inferring all these things. If they were all done properly and one was done improperly, what would that imply though? What if it was flipped? What if you started out with the now they assume it's specifically this order. You started off good and then had one that was bad. But what if you started off bad? You had a chachalo ketikna and then kulan ketiknan and then the rest were done fine. It would be pigul. Now why would it be pigul? Because you started out. Now we're going to have to figure this out. Mani, who does this go according to? Ilema Rabbanan, you can't say this is the rabbis. If you want to say it's the rabbis, for sure this would not be pigul. Now again, it's just an inference. But ha'amrei Rabbanan, emafaglim b'chatzi matir. This is still a case where, again, this what I want to say about this inference is we didn't read this way when we read the Mishnah. But what they're saying is, why did they specifically give a case where the last thought was pigul? Because if the first thought was pigul, maybe it really would be pigul. And then it can't be the rabbis, because the rabbis say emafaglim b'chatzi matir. Ella, it must be Rabbi Meir. And how would it be Rabbi Meir? The itama de Rabbi Meir. Now, it depends what Rabbi Meir holds. If he holds emafaglim b'chatzi matir, who afilu kidikatane nami. Well, if he holds, it could be pigul, even if it's a pigul thought in only part of the action. Well, then also the original line. If they did all correctly and then one incorrectly, it would be pasul and there's no karet. Well, that should also be karet. So it can't be he holds mefaglim b'chatzi matir. Because what we're basically going to say is, based on the inference of this Mishnah, the only way to understand this Mishnah is to explain it based on Rabbi Meir. And it can't be mefaglim b'chatzi matir, because then he wouldn't have said the first line, right? It would have been also pasul v'yesh bo karet. And therefore, lab mishum de kasavar, it must be because he holds. Why does it matter if you start off with pigul or end with pigul? Because if you start off with pigul, kol oseh al dat rishona oseh. Because anyone who does an action does it based on the first, meaning if you started with pigul and then the rest, what does it mean kitiknan? Kitiknan just meant you did it without saying anything. So if you did it, the first one, pigul, and the rest nothing, well, the nothing becomes pigul, and that's pigul. And that's Rabbi Meir's approach according to Rish Lakish. Okay, this is how Rish Lakish reads our Mishnah. He says the only way to read our Mishnah is this way, and that proves that that's the reasoning for Rabbi Meir. But now comes the rejection. Amar Rabbi Yishmael bar Yitzchak lo olam Rabbanani. You can explain the Mishnah according to the rabbis. Okay? My kitiknan. Now, this is a very weird way of understanding it. Kitiknan lepigul. Okay, let's go back to the line. Lefichachim natan kulam kitiknan, the way it's supposed to be. Now, we think the way it's supposed to be means proper. Now we're going to say, now we had a lot of cases where we talked about pigul. This isn't actually pigul. So now he's saying, what is kitiknan? Proper pigul. Okay? So if you did them with a real pigul machshava, that would generally disqualify it. But then you did one shelo kitiknan, you did one that wasn't pigul, then pasul ve'ein bo karet. Okay? Then it's not going to be karet. Now, how does this resolve it? Because now we're going to say this is the rabbis. The rabbis are saying, if you did all of them, in other words, and this is really the bigger chiddush. This is why you won't really need to make the inference here, because it's already telling you a lot. It's saying you could do 3 placements of the blood with real pigul machshava. As long as you do one not, pasul ve'ein bo karet, because that's Rabbanan. Okay? So now the Gemara says, wait a minute, there's a problem with that. Hami tekatane lefichachim natan kulan kitiknan. They really don't like that. What is kitiknan? Kitiknan sounds like you did it right. And then you did a chad shelo kitiknan. Sounds like you didn't do it right. And then pasul ve'en bo karet. Michlal de tikna la'echshero hu da'ata. They're saying it sounds like the tiknan is actually trying to fix it, right? Because think about it like this. If you did them all as pigul, right? Then, in other words, what it's saying is this is kitiknan and that's not kitiknan. Now, not kitiknan really means in a good way. So it's very hard to say that, right, sorry, I didn't say that right. Im natan kulan kitiknan, and then echad shelo kitiknan, what they're basically saying is the kitiknan is really sounds like it's a good thing and not a bad thing, right? We're basically turning kitiknan into something bad. And when we have the language shelo kitiknan, right, not proper, that means not the right way. So it really sounds, because they use the language shelo kitiknan, not in a good way, it makes it sound that kitiknan is in a good way, and therefore you can't really say that that's pikul. So now they're going to say, no, we have two different ways you could read that. One is Rava, one is Rav Ashi. Amar Rava, ma shelo kitikna, chutz limkomo. That's we're going to say the lo kitikna could actually be not proper pigul, which is a chutz limkomo pigul. And then we have our classic eruv machshavot. You have chutz lizmano with chutz limkomo. Because of that, it's not karet. Or Rav Ashi says shelo lishma. Okay, that shelo kitikna could be shelo lishma also. We have the same thing there. Lo lishmo is, right, pigul mixed with lo lishmo creates a situation of pasal ve'en bo karet. So you really could say that kitiknan is pigul and shelo kitiknan is either chutz limkomo or shelo lishma. And that's how Rabbi Yishmael bar Yitzchak explains it in a way that this all fits with the rabbi's opinion. Because again, it's basically teaching you emefagli machatzi matir. The Gemara is going to question this though and say, wait, michlal dechi lo avid lachutz limkomo v'shelo lishmo mechayev. Wait a minute. Are you saying though that if you don't do it, if you didn't do a chutz limkomo or shelo lishma, you be chayav? In other words, that makes it sound like the Mishnah is saying, if you did them all as real pigul and one improperly, like chutz limkomo or shelo lishma, because it's disqualified for some other reason, it's going to be pasal ve'en bo karet. But then it sounds like if you did 3 as pigul and 1 as nothing, it would be pigul. But that's not true. So that doesn't make any sense. So they say, no. Don't make that inference. Obviously, if you did all kitiknan and 1 not, and you just did it regular, there's no pigul because the chidush here, though, is that if you did 3 pigul and 1 chutz limkomo or 1 lishma, shelo lishma, then there's not going to be karet. And the reason why they worded it like this was, Adi detani reisha, pigul v'chayavim alav karet, tananami seifa pasul ve'en bo karet. They wanted to teach you this pasul ve'en bo karet because, okay, now you have to really look at the reisha again to understand this line. But the reisha, I brought it here on the sheet. If you did the rishona kitikna, and the shniya chutz limkoma, right? If you did the first one the way it was supposed to, and the second one not, that was in the case where all you needed was 1, it's pigul and you're chayavim karet. And now they want to compare. Now it works perfectly the way we just explained it. Because the reisha is saying, in the case of the ones done outside where you really only need 1, if you do the first pigul, the second, right, chutz lizmana, and the second pigul chutz limkoma, that's going to be pigul that you have karet for because we ignore the second one. But in the case of the mizbeach hapnimi, if you do 3 piguls and 1 chutz limkoma, it's already not going to be disqualified because it's disqualified, but it's not karet because all of those were necessary. And that's why it uses and not to infer you're going to get karet if the fourth one was done for no particular, disqualified reason. No, for sure there's no karet there also. But the chiddush was to compare it to the earlier case. So here's my chart to review. Okay, this is basically saying, just 1 minute, change the view here if I can do that. Here. Okay, 1 sec. Okay, so now I just want to share this chart, and we're going to look at this chart. So the chart, just was worried the other view I was blocking it. So the chart summarizes. If, according to Rish Lakish, lefichach kulam kitiknan is a regular case, you did it properly, and echad, right, you did all kitiknan, echad shelo kitiknan, 1 not properly, that's right, which means a pigul, that's not going to be pigul, right? Why not? Well, okay. Yes, it's true. It's because Ein Mefaglim B'Chatzi Matir, but in the end, because of the inference from there, that if you started with pigul and ended with not pigul, the flip case, then only Rabbi Meir would say, we follow your machshava rishona. And the Mishnah really follows Rabbi Meir's opinion. But Rabbi Yishmael Bar Yitzchak figured out how to explain the Mishnah according to the rabbis as well, by changing what kitiknan and lo kitiknan meant. Kitiknan actually means proper pigul, chutz lizmano. And lo kitiknan is some other kind of disqualification. And if you have a combo of those two, well, that's the rabbis, because you don't really have pigul for the whole matir. And in addition, if you have both pigul and something else, then, it's disqualified for a different reason. It's a little bit weak, that interpretation, because then you're taking it out of the whole idea about, it's really more talking about the Ein Mefaglim B'Chatzi Matir, that you're only doing it during part, or at least that's what we thought. Maybe it's not what we thought. Okay, so what did we do today? Just to review, we started with this lipar, and the big different interpretation is lipar, the par Yom Kippurim, or according to Rabbi Yishmael, there's no point to have lipar Yom Kippurim, because that din you could learn from a Kal Vachomer, and lipar is the par Lim Davar Shel Tzibur. And it's said there so that you could learn explicitly a law from about the Yoteret HaKaved and Shtei Klayot, is if it's learned explicitly, so then we could teach from there to the Seir of Avodah Zarah. And then we talked about this Braita that supported that reading, right? And then how we have this comparison, this Hekesh from the one to the other. We had some difficulty. We have a different pasuk with Hekesh we have two drashot, the Chatat one and the Chatatan. So one is for the sprinkling and one is for the Yoteret and the Shtei Klayot. Then we got back to ask about Rav Pappa. Papa doesn't really seem to match Rebbi, because Rav Pappa doesn't say it's l'chol inyan. He said it's only really compared for these three particular halachot. And then we said there were two different approaches. There's the Tana Debei Rebbi and there's the Tana Debei Rabbi Yishmael, and they each have two different approaches about how much we learn from the par Yom Kippurim from the par Kohen Mashiach to the par Yom Kippurim. Then we got to these two Braito comparing this. Why is the Yoteret HaKaved only written by the par Kohen Mashiach, and why does it say Baruch HaKodesh by the par Kohen Mashiach? Comparing the difference between God getting angry at the people and God getting angry, or when the people rebel against God, and rather than when the Kohen Gadol rebels against God. And then we got to this last line in the Mishnah, Lefichach im yotan kulan kitiknan, and we had two ways to read that, and does it match with bringing this Mishnah of Rabbi Meir? Really, we brought this Mishnah Menachot of Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim. Really, this was a totally different thing, whereas Rabbi Rish Lakish was explaining that Mishnah has nothing to do, Rabbi Meir's opinion, with Ein Mefaglim B'Chatzi Matir, has to do with where you did the first one b'machshava and the second one b'shtika. We assume your second goes by your first thought, and that's the machlok of Rabbi Meir and the rabbis, and that was proven by how Rish Lakish read our Mishnah. The problem is that Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yitzchak said you don't have to read our Mishnah that way, and he had a totally different reading from the Mishnah and could read our Mishnah like the rabbis, and then there's really no proof for what Rish Lakish said about the Mishnah in Menachot. With that, we finish our quite complicated daf. I hope it was clear enough for you. Hope the sheet will help you to review it. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and a Shavua Tov.